The flashing red and blue lights painted my front porch like a crime scene while I stood there barefoot, holding my morning coffee, watching two officers climb out of their cruiser as if they were about to serve a warrant. Across the street, Karen stood dramatically clutching her phone to her chest, her other hand pointing straight at me like I had just escaped from prison. "That's him," she shouted. "He's trespassing on my property." The ridiculous part was that I was standing in my own yard, the same spot I had mowed, watered, and paid taxes on for the last 7 years. The officers exchanged a look that screamed confusion, but professionalism forced them to walk toward me anyway. The shorter one, Officer Daniels, cleared his throat and said, "Sir, we got a call about a trespasser. You live here?" I blinked, pointed at the giant blue mailbox with my name literally painted on it, and said, "Only every day of my life." That was the hook of the day, the moment Karen decided to turn neighborly irritation into a full-blown police drama. Karen had been my neighbor for almost 3 years, and from the start she treated the property line like a border between two rival nations. She was the self-appointed HOA queen, the type who measured grass height with a ruler and sent emails about aesthetic violations. I had learned to tune her out after the first few warnings about my unapproved garden gnome, but lately her attitude had shifted from nosy to obsessive. The week before the 911 incident, she'd confronted me about trimming the hedge that technically stood on my side but leaned slightly toward her driveway. She called it destruction of shared property. I called it basic landscaping. We left that argument simmering, but I didn't expect her to take it to the nuclear level by calling the cops. The officers asked to see some ID, which I provided without complaint. They took one look at my driver's license, matched it with the address, and their faces softened into expressions of disbelief. Daniels walked back toward Karen, who was pacing like she'd just lost a court case. "Ma'am," he said, "he owns this house." Karen's voice rose several octaves higher than normal, shrieking that I was lying, that she had documents, that I had encroached onto HOA land. She waved a crumpled piece of paper that looked like a printed email, not an official record. The other officer, Ramirez, politely asked her to calm down, but that only made her louder. It was the kind of spectacle that draws curtains open and cell phones out, and soon half the cul-de-sac was peeking through their blinds. When the police finally left, apologizing to me and warning her about false reporting, Karen shouted after them that she'd be contacting the HOA board. I stood in my yard, the scent of my spilled coffee mingling with the freshly cut grass, thinking about how absurd the whole thing was. But underneath the absurdity, something darkly satisfying began to spark in my mind. Because if she wanted to play legal games, she had no idea who she was dealing with. I wasn't some passive homeowner who'd roll over every time she waved a bylaw in my face. I had receipts, patience, and a deep love for poetic justice. The next day, I started noticing small acts of pettiness. My mailbox was slightly dented. A bright orange HOA notice appeared on my door claiming my fence paint was non-compliant with community standards. The timing was suspiciously perfect, less than 24 hours after the police visit. Karen, it seemed, was doubling down. I took pictures of everything. When I saw her walking her Pomeranian later that evening, she gave me a triumphant smirk, the kind that said she thought she'd gotten away with something. I smiled back because I already knew how this game would end, even if she didn't. The story really took off a week later when I received a letter from the HOA demanding payment for an unapproved structure. The structure in question? A tool shed that had existed before I even moved in, clearly documented in the property's sale record. It was obvious she was feeding the board misinformation. I decided to pay a visit to the HOA office myself. What I found there was better than any revenge plan I could have dreamed up. The clerk, an older man named Bill, remembered me from when I first bought the house. When I told him about the letter, he frowned and pulled out my property file. As he flipped through the pages, his eyebrows rose. "That's weird," he muttered. "Your property boundaries are actually larger than the HOA's last updated map shows." He pointed to a faded diagram that clearly extended my yard several feet beyond the fence line, right into what Karen believed was her territory. I asked if I could get a copy of that document, and he happily obliged. As I walked out of the office, holding that single piece of paper, it felt like carrying Excalibur. Karen's entire crusade was about to backfire spectacularly. I didn't say a word to her at first. I simply started measuring out my true boundary lines with a long orange tape measure, right in plain sight. She came running out the second she saw me, waving her phone like it was a sword. "You can't expand your yard," she screamed. "This is HOA land." I calmly showed her the official county map copy and said, "Actually, this is my land. You've been mowing it for free." The look on her face was priceless. Pure, silent horror mixed with disbelief. For the next few days, she sulked. But then she tried a new tactic. She emailed the HOA accusing me of forging documents. That was her mistake. Bill from the office personally verified their authenticity when the board called him. That's when I learned something even better. The HOA's lease agreement for the communal lot behind our homes had expired, and they were scrambling to renew it before the end of the quarter. And guess whose property technically overlapped that land by a few critical feet? Mine. It meant that technically, part of the HOA's communal playground was on private property, my property. That realization changed everything. I could see the dominoes lining up perfectly. If Karen kept pushing, she'd force the HOA to look into property lines and legal use rights, which would inevitably expose the overlap. And when they did, they'd have to renegotiate or vacate. Either way, Karen's dream of ruling the neighborhood with her laminated bylaws would crumble. I just needed to wait for her to make one more big mistake. It didn't take long. 2 weeks after the 911 call, she decided to host an HOA safety meeting in her driveway. It was really just an excuse to gossip and complain about me. I watched from my porch as she distributed pamphlets titled Community Order and Cooperation. The irony nearly made me choke on my iced tea. She started ranting about certain homeowners who disrespect boundaries, and that's when I stepped over my fence with the county map in hand and said, "Funny thing, Karen. About boundaries." The crowd turned curious. She tried to talk over me, but the neighbors were already whispering. They'd seen her tantrums, her notes, her 911 stunt. The tide was turning. That night, as I sat on my porch under the soft hum of the porch light, I knew the real story hadn't even started yet. The police visit, the petty notices, the boundary drama, they were just the prelude. The real twist was coming, and it would unfold through paperwork, timing, and a single signature that would change everything. For now, I let Karen think she'd won another round. She could have her gossip circle and her sense of control. Because in the end, when the eviction notice came, the ink on it would be mine. After the chaotic morning with the police, I thought things might settle down, but Karen didn't know the meaning of de-escalation. The 911 call had only emboldened her, and within 2 days she began what could only be described as a neighborhood smear campaign. It started small, a rumor here, a whispered complaint there, but by the weekend she had half the cul-de-sac convinced that I was some kind of unhinged troublemaker who didn't respect HOA authority. I found out when my mail carrier quietly mentioned that someone had filed a complaint claiming my mailbox was installed too close to the curb. That someone didn't need to be named. Everyone knew it was Karen. It was almost impressive how quickly she managed to weaponize bureaucracy. But what she didn't realize was that her own paperwork trail was about to choke her ambitions. I decided to dig deeper. If she wanted a war of documents, I'd bring an archive to the fight. My first stop was the county records office, the same dusty building where homeownership files from the 1980s still sat in metal drawers. I walked in with a quiet grin, knowing that somewhere in there lay the proof of my property boundaries, the ones she had ignored. The clerk, a man who looked perpetually bored, took my address, rummaged through a set of folders, and handed me a stack of documents thicker than a sandwich. As I scanned through, I found not only the map confirming my boundaries but also something unexpected. The HOA's incorporation file listed the founder's signatures, and there it was, Karen's ex-husband. Apparently, he had been one of the original members who set up the HOA years before they divorced. I didn't know what their breakup was about, but judging by her obsession with rules and control, I could guess that the HOA had become her way of clinging to what she'd lost. That realization didn't make me sympathetic. It just gave me insight into how she operated. While I copied every relevant document, I noticed another peculiar detail. The HOA's jurisdiction map was outdated and failed to include several houses built after an expansion project 5 years ago, including mine. Technically, that meant my property wasn't even under HOA control. I double-checked the file dates, the registration seals, and the renewal stamps. It was clear. They had never updated the jurisdiction after annexing our section of the neighborhood. My lot was outside their legal boundary. It was one of those quiet, bureaucratic miracles that no one notices until it becomes a weapon. Karen had been sending me notices, threatening fines, and demanding compliance for years when legally, she had no authority over me at all. That single discovery shifted the balance of power entirely. I couldn't wait to see her face when she learned she'd been policing someone she had no legal claim to. I walked out of that office with a folder under my arm and a plan forming in my mind. But before executing anything, I needed confirmation. So, I met with a local property lawyer named Laura who specialized in HOA dispute. She was sharp, straightforward, and had a dry sense of humor that made the consultation unexpectedly enjoyable. I laid out the documents, told her about Karen's antics, and waited for her verdict. After 15 minutes of reading, Laura leaned back, smirking. "You're not under HOA jurisdiction," she said, tapping the boundary map. "They never filed the extension correctly. Every fine, every notice, they're meaningless. If she pushes again, we can send a formal cease and desist." My heart practically danced. For the first time since I moved into that neighborhood, I had leverage. Real, legal leverage. But Laura wasn't done. "If you want to really make it sting," she continued, "we can file a notice of exemption with the county and send a courtesy copy to the HOA president. That'll make it official, public record. It'll hit her harder than any argument." I left that office with more than a plan. I left with ammunition. Over the next few days, I played it cool. Karen seemed pleased with herself, probably believing she'd scared me into submission. She began leaving smug comments whenever I was outside, saying things like, "I hope you learned your lesson about trespassing." One evening she even handed me a new notice citing me for disruptive lawn care practices. Apparently, my leaf blower was too loud during quiet hours. I took it with a smile and thanked her politely, which confused her. She didn't realize that every letter she sent was another piece of evidence. By Thursday, I filed the exemption paperwork through Laura's office, complete with notarized verification and a certified mailing receipt to the HOA board. I didn't need to tell Karen right away. I wanted her to find out the hard way. That weekend, the HOA held its monthly meeting, and for the first time, I decided to attend. When I walked into the community center, conversations halted mid-sentence. Karen was standing near the podium with her ever-present clipboard, glaring at me like I'd shown up uninvited to her coronation. "Homeowners only, please," she said in her sweetest venom. "Perfect," I replied, "that's why I'm here." The board chair, a man named Ed who always looked one signature away from retirement, asked what issue I wanted to raise. I calmly placed my folder on the table and said, "Before we start, I'd like to clarify that my property doesn't fall under HOA jurisdiction. Here's the county record to confirm." The silence that followed was delicious. Karen's jaw dropped. She lunged toward the papers, scanning them frantically, her eyes darting between pages. "That's not possible," she stammered. We voted to include that section." "You might have voted," I said, "but you never filed." The board murmured. Ed adjusted his glasses, reading the notarized document carefully. "He's right," he said, almost apologetically. "The HOA map wasn't amended with the county. Legally, his lot is outside our governance." For once, Karen was speechless. Then the outrage came in waves. She accused me of manipulating records, bribing officials, even attacking community unity. But the board members had already turned skeptical. They'd seen her act before, and now her credibility was cracking. When I stood up to leave, she tried to block my path, hissing, "You think you've won?" I leaned in just enough to whisper, "No. I've just started playing." Then I walked out while she fumed behind me. The whispers followed me all the way to the door. That night, Karen escalated again. I caught her on my security camera sneaking near my fence, snapping photos as if collecting evidence for another complaint. I didn't confront her. Instead, I forwarded the footage to Laura, who advised me to let her dig her own hole. The next day, Karen posted a lengthy rant on the neighborhood Facebook group accusing me of harassing law enforcement and undermining community safety. Within hours, the comments section turned into a battlefield. Half the neighborhood defended me, saying they'd seen how she treated everyone, while the other half simply watched the drama unfold with popcorn emojis. The more she talked, the more she revealed her obsession. She didn't realize she was destroying her own reputation one post at a time. By the following week, the HOA board quietly sent out an email announcing a review of all past enforcement actions to ensure compliance with legal jurisdiction. It was bureaucratic code for damage control. Karen's influence was slipping. I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight, but I also knew she couldn't win anymore. The foundation of her power, the idea that she controlled everyone's property, had crumbled, and now she was desperate to rebuild it, even if it meant burning herself in the process. The turning point came one afternoon when I received a knock on my door. It was Bill from the records office, holding an envelope. "You might want to see this," he said with a grin. Inside was a copy of a newly filed document from the HOA. Karen had tried to retroactively expand the HOA boundary to include my property, but she'd submitted it incorrectly, missing signatures and attaching the wrong map version. It was rejected within a day. It was official now. Her last attempt to drag me under HOA control had failed completely. I pinned the rejection letter to my bulletin board like a trophy. When I walked outside that evening, Karen was in her driveway pretending to water her flowers, though it was obvious she was waiting for me. I waved cheerfully and said, "Hey Karen, just so you know, the county sent me your application. Maybe next time double-check the forms before filing." The color drained from her face, and for once, she didn't have a comeback. It was the first silent moment between us since I'd moved in, and I savored it. But deep down, I knew silence from Karen wasn't peace. It was the sound of her plotting something worse. The war of paperwork was over, but the personal one was just beginning, and she was about to find out that revenge doesn't always come through confrontation. Sometimes it comes through contracts, signatures, and one very ironic eviction notice waiting in the near future. Karen's silence lasted 3 peaceful days, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe she had finally accepted defeat, but I should have known better. When people like Karen lose control, they don't disappear, they regroup. It started with small signs, like her sprinklers mysteriously turning on every time I walked near the property line, drenching me without fail, or her dog leaving gifts suspiciously close to my mailbox every morning. I ignored it at first, but then came the letters. Not from the HOA this time, but from various county departments, noise complaints, zoning inquiries, even a supposed inspection request from the environmental office. Every envelope had the same familiar pattern, printed at home, addressed in a handwriting that tried too hard to look official. It was sloppy revenge, but it meant she was still obsessed. I wasn't angry anymore, I was entertained. She was wasting her time while I was preparing something far more satisfying. One morning, I stepped outside to find a fresh yard sign planted at the edge of my lawn. It read, "Under HOA review, a non-compliant property." I nearly laughed out loud. It was so obviously handmade, with crooked lettering and mismatched paint. She had gone from calling 911 to arts and crafts propaganda. I left it there for the day just to see how long it would take her to realize I wasn't going to bite. By sunset, she snuck back to retrieve it, thinking no one saw her, but my doorbell camera caught everything in crystal clarity. I archived the footage, labeling it Karen's Craft Project. The truth was, every stunt she pulled only made my eventual victory more poetic. What she didn't know was that the HOA board had quietly launched an internal investigation after the boundary fiasco. Apparently, they had discovered discrepancies in several financial reports, small but suspicious gaps in maintenance fund. It didn't take long for whispers to start, and soon everyone suspected Karen. She was, after all, the only one with near unlimited access to the records. I didn't have to lift a finger. Karma was doing all the heavy lifting. I overheard the details from Ed, the board chair, when I ran into him at the hardware store. He told me, in a low voice, that they had found checks made out to consultants who didn't exist and invoices for landscaping work that was never completed. I kept my face neutral, but inside I was thrilled. She had been so obsessed with controlling everyone else that she'd left a paper trail big enough to choke her career as self-proclaimed neighborhood queen. The next HOA meeting was different. Normally, Karen would arrive early to rearrange chairs, organize paperwork, and assert dominance over anyone foolish enough to question her. But this time, she arrived late, hair frazzled, holding a stack of folders like shield. The board had called an emergency review session, and I decided to attend again, purely for entertainment. The room was tense, the kind of tension that crackles before a storm. Ed cleared his throat and began, "We've found irregularities in the HOA's financial records." The collective gasp that followed was theatrical. Karen immediately launched into a speech about clerical errors and miscommunication, but her usual charm had lost its power. The neighbors were done humoring her. When she realized the crowd wasn't on her side, she turned her frustration toward me, shouting, "He's behind this. He's trying to ruin me." I calmly raised an eyebrow and replied, "Karen, I've been busy repainting my fence. You're doing a fine job ruining yourself." The laughter that followed shattered whatever control she had left. That night, she stormed into my yard, screaming about conspiracies and lawsuit. I didn't even step outside. I just let my security camera record every word. Eventually, the police showed up again, this time called by another neighbor tired of the noise. I watched from my window as the officers spoke with her for nearly 20 minutes before escorting her back home. It was poetic justice. The same flashing lights that once humiliated me were now reflected on her manicured lawn. But her downfall wasn't complete yet. A few days later, I received an unexpected call from Laura, my lawyer. She said the HOA's attorney had reached out to verify my exemption filing and mentioned something unusual. The HOA's property management contract had been signed under Karen's name, but her authorization had expired 6 months ago. That meant every action she'd taken recently, every fine, every warning, every notice, was legally invalid. Laura laughed and said, "If you wanted to push this further, you could sue her for harassment and defamation." I didn't want money, I wanted irony. So instead of going to court, I decided to set the stage for her own undoing. I spent the next week gathering everything: emails, letters, photos, videos. Every petty act she'd done was neatly organized in a folder labeled Karen's Greatest Hits. I dropped off a copy at the HOA board's office anonymously, along with copies of her unauthorized contracts. It didn't take long for the dominoes to fall. Within days, the board sent an official notice suspending her, pending investigation. For once, the neighborhood felt calm. Children played outside without being scolded for running too loudly. Cars parked without measuring tape appearing overnight. The air itself seemed lighter. But Karen wasn't the type to surrender quietly. She started visiting every neighbor one by one, knocking on doors with a rehearsed speech about unfair targeting and false accusations. Some listened politely, others shut their doors immediately. When she reached my house, I opened the door with the biggest grin I could manage. "Can I help you?" I asked, though I already knew what was coming. "You did this," she spat. "You and your fake paperwork. You think you can make me look stupid." I tilted my head and said softly, "Karen, I don't need to make you look stupid. You handle that on your own." She turned red and left without another word, nearly tripping over her dog leash as she stomped off. I watched her go, realizing that her anger wasn't just about control, it was about humiliation. She had built her identity around being in charge, and now that illusion was gone. A few days later, a large envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was an official HOA communication addressed to all residents, announcing a leadership election. The board had voted to remove Karen from her position as compliance chair pending financial review. The best part? They were encouraging new community participation. I didn't plan to run, but I couldn't resist attending the election meeting just to see her reaction. When I arrived, the room was packed. The tension was delicious. Ed began reading the results, and when Karen's removal was confirmed by majority vote, the room erupted in applause. She stood up to protest, waving her hands, but Ed silenced her with a single sentence. "Karen, please sit down. You're no longer recognized as a board member." It was over. Walking home that evening felt like victory. The sky was painted gold by the setting sun, and for once, the cul-de-sac was quiet. No barking orders, no flyers taped to doors. I should have felt satisfied, and I did, but there was still one loose thread. Her house. Over the last few months, I had heard whispers that she was behind on her mortgage payment. Apparently, her ex-husband had stopped contributing to the property costs, and her obsession with fines and lawsuits had drained her savings. The rumor didn't surprise me, but it made me wonder how far she would fall before hitting rock bottom. The answer came sooner than expected. A week after her removal, a real estate agent's sign appeared in her yard, "For sale." The neighbors buzzed with gossip. Some said the HOA forced her out, others believed she was leaving out of shame. I didn't care which was true. I just watched as movers packed her boxes, each one labeled with neat handwriting, probably hers. The once dominant queen of the neighborhood now looked small, defeated, a shadow of the woman who once called the police on me for standing in my yard. I could have left it at that. But life, in its strange symmetry, handed me an ending too perfect to resist. The day before she moved, I received a letter from the HOA confirming that I was now the legal owner of a small shared strip of land near the neighborhood entrance, land the HOA had used for signage and storage. It came as part of the boundary correction Laura had filed weeks ago. That meant the HOA owed me rent for their structures on my land. And when I looked at the paperwork, I noticed the section for authorized signatures. I smiled as I realized what it meant. Someone from the HOA would have to sign an agreement acknowledging my ownership. The irony was exquisite because I already knew who that person was. Karen, despite being removed, was still the official signer of record until her resignation paperwork processed. She would have to sign it herself before moving. The same woman who once called 911 on me for trespassing would soon have to sign a legal document acknowledging that she had been living next to land that wasn't hers, and that I now owned part of what she had once ruled over. That night, I sat on my porch, sipping coffee, watching her house go dark. The neighborhood was quiet again, but I knew the calm was temporary. Karen wasn't done yet, not entirely. People like her never just fade away. They cling to the illusion of control until it slips through their fingers. I smiled to myself because this time I wasn't just waiting for her next move. I had already written the ending. She just didn't know she'd be signing it. The morning she came to my porch with the eviction papers in her trembling hands was the moment I knew the tables had turned completely. Not her eviction, not yet, but mine, or at least that's what she thought she was delivering. She looked confident again, the same brittle, overpainted confidence she had during her reign as HOA enforcer, except now it was cracked around the edges like a porcelain cup glued back together too many times. She didn't bother with greetings. "You've been served," she said, thrusting the envelope forward like it was a sword. I took it, thanked her, and shut the door without another word. Inside, I opened it calmly, already guessing it would be another desperate, hollow attempt. The document was a notice citing illegal expansion of property boundary. She was trying to weaponize the county against me after losing her HOA authority. I read it carefully, checked the letterhead, and smiled. It wasn't even filed properly, it was just a draft. She had printed it herself and forged a signature. It was sad, really. The once powerful HOA queen reduced to fake paperwork. Still, it gave me an idea. If she wanted to make this official, I'd make it truly official, and the result would be something she could never undo. That afternoon I called Laura, my lawyer, and told her everything. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped her pen. "You're kidding," she said. "She's forging county documents now?" I sent her a photo of the paper. "Not only is it fake," she said, "but she used the wrong format. It's like she Googled eviction form and tried to fill it in herself." Laura paused for a moment, her tone shifting. "You know, if she's harassing you with fake legal notices, we can take this to court. Or, if you prefer something more poetic, we can use this against her when her property dispute comes up." I liked the sound of that. I didn't want to sue her. I wanted her undone by her own obsession. So Laura helped me draft a real legal response, not to her directly, but to the HOA's property manager and the county housing board, attaching her forged document as evidence of resident misconduct. We didn't accuse her by name, but anyone reading it would know who it pointed to. It was subtle, surgical revenge. While the paperwork simmered in the system, I kept playing the role of the calm, amused neighbor. Every time she passed by, muttering insults under her breath, I waved and smiled. She hated that more than anything. I could see the fury in her eyes every time I acted unbothered. She started leaving earlier for work, probably to avoid seeing me. But one evening, I caught her on her porch pacing back and forth, phone pressed to her ear, whispering furiously. My security camera's audio picked up fragments, words like attorney, lawsuit, proof, and deadline. She was clearly planning something. I decided to let her. The best revenge sometimes comes from letting your opponent dig their own grave. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from the county inspector's office. It was an official notice requesting verification of boundary markers on both properties, mine and hers. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint about encroachment. It didn't take a genius to guess who. The letter stated that a county officer would visit the properties for verification. I didn't panic. Instead, I called Bill at the records office, the same man who'd helped me months ago. When I told him about the upcoming inspection, he chuckled. "Oh, that's going to be interesting," he said. "Because according to our most recent update, her driveway is actually built 6 inches over the line onto your property." I nearly dropped the phone. "You're serious?" He confirmed it. Apparently, her ex-husband had added an extension years ago without a permit, and it had gone unnoticed because the old maps were inaccurate. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. The same woman who accused me of trespassing was technically parking her car on my land. The inspection day arrived on a warm Saturday morning. The county officer, a calm middle-aged man named Peter, arrived with his measuring tools and documents. Karen was already outside, arms crossed, her expression smug as if she'd already won. "I'm glad you're here," she said loudly to Peter. "He's been moving the fence line for months." I just stood there silently, letting her talk. Peter nodded politely and began his work. He measured, checked markers, compared notes. Karen followed him like a shadow, throwing in little comments about community rules and property integrity. When he finally stopped, he looked at both of us and cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "it seems there's a bit of an issue. Mrs. Carter, Your driveway extension is over the property line by approximately 6 inches. The silence that followed was delicious. Karen's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, searching for a response that didn't exist. That can't be right, she finally managed to say. Peter shrugged. We'll confirm with the records office, but as of this inspection, it's technically encroachment. He handed both of us copies of the preliminary report and left. I watched her face crumble as the reality sank in. She wasn't just wrong. She was guilty of the exact thing she accused me of. By that evening, word had spread through the neighborhood. Karen had become the latest gossip headline. Some neighbors were kind enough not to mention it to her directly, but others found excuses to bring it up casually. She couldn't stand it. I saw her moving her car to park farther up the street, away from the supposed disputed area. That night, her porch light stayed off for the first time since I'd known her. It was small, but symbolic. Her little throne had gone dark. A few days later, I received another visit from Laura. She came over in person, holding a folder. "You're going to like this," she said, sitting down on my porch swing. Inside the folder was a notice from the bank. Karen's property was under review for non-payment. Apparently, she'd fallen behind on her mortgage, and with the pending property violation, the lender was considering foreclosure. "You didn't do this, right?" Laura asked, half joking. "No," I said truthfully. "I just let her ruin herself." Laura grinned. "Well, here's the funny part. If the foreclosure proceeds, the county will put the property up for auction. And since part of her land technically sits on your lot, you'll get first right of refusal to bid." I sat back stunned. The irony was becoming almost biblical. Over the next week, Karen spiraled. She stopped speaking to anyone. The once pristine lawn grew patchy. The Pomeranian barked constantly while she ignored it. The HOA board tried to distance themselves, claiming her conduct had brought unnecessary attention to the community. When I passed her one morning, she looked exhausted, her eyes red, her voice small. "You've ruined me," she said quietly. There was no venom left, just defeat. "No, Karen," I replied softly. "You ruined yourself. You just needed an audience." She didn't respond. She turned and walked inside, closing the door gently. It was strange seeing her fragile like that, the fire gone. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Weeks passed, and her house officially went on the auction list. The neighborhood buzzed with curiosity, but most people avoided talking to her. On the day of the auction, I dressed neatly and drove to the courthouse. Laura joined me, paperwork in hand. When the bidding started, I stayed quiet through the early offers. Karen sat a few rows ahead, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed forward. When the price dipped within reach, I raised my hand. Her head turned sharply, recognition dawning too late. I didn't even have to win. Just the sight of me bidding was enough to break her composure. She stormed out before the auction ended. Later, Laura called to tell me I'd won the bid. The property was mine pending final paperwork. I couldn't believe it. The woman who once called 911 on me for standing in my own yard had lost her home, and through nothing more than patience and irony, I had become its owner. When the sale finalized a month later, I received a thick envelope containing all the necessary transfer documents. Among them was one page requiring her signature to release occupancy right. It was standard procedure, but the name printed on the line made me laugh out loud. She had to sign it. The same hand that once wrote fake violation letters now had to acknowledge me as the rightful owner. The county office arranged for her to meet me in person for the final handoff. The meeting was awkward, to say the least. She arrived looking smaller than ever, clutching her pen like it was a lifeline. I placed the document on the table between us, watching her eyes flicker to the bold text. Transfer of occupancy, authorized by county order. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, without a word, she signed it. The sound of the pen scratching the paper was almost musical. When it was done, I thanked her and walked away, leaving her to stare at the paper that symbolized the end of her reign. That night, as I sat on the same porch where this all began, I thought about how absurd it was. A single false accusation had spiraled into a war of pride, paperwork, and poetic justice. She had tried to erase me from my own home, and in the end, she'd erased herself. The red and blue lights that once flashed for her call now seemed like distant ghosts, replaced by the calm hum of crickets and the faint glimmer of peace. I didn't feel triumphant or cruel, just satisfied. Because sometimes, life doesn't need you to seek revenge. It just needs you to stand your ground, watch patiently, and let karma sign the eviction notice for you. By the time the transfer papers were finalized, I thought the story had reached its end, but fate had one last dramatic act waiting. Owning Karen's former property should have felt like closure, yet it came with a strange mix of triumph and curiosity. I wasn't interested in gloating. I was fascinated by what she had left behind. When I first stepped through her front door as the new owner, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old dust. The furniture was gone, but traces of her remained, sticky notes on the fridge reminding herself about HOA meetings, a forgotten binder labeled community order, and a single framed quote on the wall that said, "Control is peace." It was hauntingly ironic. I explored the rooms quietly, half expecting her ghost to jump out waving a clipboard. Instead, I found something even more revealing. In the back of her home office, a filing cabinet had been left unlocked. Inside were letters, not official ones but handwritten notes from neighbors complaining about her behavior over the years. Apparently, she had kept them all as if they were trophies. Some were apologetic, others furious, but every one of them told the same story. She had alienated the entire community in her pursuit of control. Reading them, I realized that she wasn't just entitled, she was lonely. Control had been her only way of feeling important. Still, I couldn't forget the humiliation she'd caused me, so I didn't feel too bad. The irony of her downfall was poetic enough to satisfy anyone. I spent the next few weeks renovating the place, not to live in it but to rent it out. Every brushstroke of paint felt like erasing her fingerprint. Neighbors stopped by now and then, curious to see what I'd done with the house. They all had stories. Times she'd fine them for having the wrong shade of mailbox, accused them of disturbing community peace for trimming trees, or reported their guests for parking too long. One elderly couple even brought over a bottle of wine as thanks, saying, "You don't know what it's like living next to her for 10 years. I did know. I just nodded and smiled. What they didn't know was that I had plans for this property, and it involved a little more than repainting walls. You see, as the new owner, I had to deal with one final bit of HOA red tape. The board required a transfer of ownership review meeting for any property change within the neighborhood. That meant I'd have to attend another session, this time as Karen's replacement. I almost skipped it, but then Laura convinced me to go. "You'll like this," she said, "trust me." When I arrived, I immediately noticed the new atmosphere. Gone were the rigid seating charts and tense silences. People were laughing, chatting, even sharing snacks. Ed, the board chair, greeted me warmly. "Glad to have you here," he said, "and glad to be free of certain personalities." The room chuckled. But then came the twist. Midway through the meeting, the discussion turned to the upcoming election for HOA leadership. Apparently, the board was looking for a new vice president, and several members suggested my name. At first, I laughed it off, but the idea spread like wildfire. "You know the rules better than anyone," someone said. "And you've proven you can stand up to unfairness." I wasn't sure whether to be flattered or horrified. The idea of taking Karen's old position was poetic justice, but it also felt like walking into her shadow. That night, I lay awake thinking about it. Becoming vice president would mean inheriting her former power, but I could use it differently, to undo her messes, to make the HOA actually fair. The next morning, I agreed to run, half out of curiosity, half out of irony. Within a week, the vote was held, and I won unanimously. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man Karen had once tried to drive out of the neighborhood was now in charge of it. If there was ever proof that karma had a sense of humor, this was it. My first order of business was cleaning up her legacy. I went through the old rulebook and shredded half the unnecessary bylaws she'd added, restrictions on garden decorations, limits on barbecue hours, even fines for mismatched curtains visible from the street. The neighborhood sighed with relief. People started inviting each other over again. Kids played outside without fear of being reported. It felt like reclaiming peace, one rule at a time. But the deeper I went into her files, the more I discovered how far she had gone to manipulate the system. She had kept secret notes on residents, recording small details like who owed late fees, who argued at meetings, and who had once insulted her dog. It was a strange, obsessive archive of control. I deleted every one of them except one, the note about me. It read, subject, uncooperative, disrespects HOA authority. Must be taught compliance. I framed that note and hung it in my new office as a reminder of how ridiculous this all started. Then came the day of ultimate irony, the eviction notice. Not mine this time, but hers. About a month after she signed over the property, the county officially processed her foreclosure, and she was sent a formal eviction order from the rental she'd moved into. She hadn't paid her security deposit, apparently. The universe was relentless. What made it even funnier was that the paperwork had to be processed through the local housing association, which meant the notice bore my signature at the bottom. It wasn't intentional, it was just how the system worked now that I was vice president. But when I saw the file come through my office inbox, I couldn't help but laugh out loud. The same woman who called 911 on me for standing in my own yard would now receive an eviction notice stamped with my name. It was almost too perfect. I didn't gloat though. I kept it professional. The letter was mailed automatically, and I moved on with my day. But a few nights later, I saw her outside my old property, parked in her car, staring at the house. It was late, past midnight, and I watched from my porch across the street. She didn't get out, she just sat there, engine idling, headlights off. For a moment, I wondered if she was there out of bitterness or nostalgia. Maybe both. Eventually, she drove away, and I never saw her again. But even then, I didn't feel anger, just a strange sense of completion, like the story had finally run its course. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The neighborhood grew friendlier. The fences that once symbolized division now had flower boxes hanging from them. During one community barbecue, someone joked that I should write a book about the whole ordeal. You could call it The HOA Strikes Back, one neighbor laughed. I smiled, thinking how absurd it all sounded when condensed into a title. Yet, beneath the humor there was truth. The entire ordeal had taught me that control, real control, wasn't about power or rules. It was about patience, logic, and the ability to stand firm while chaos burns around you. One afternoon, as I was trimming my hedge, a moving truck pulled up at the house next door. A new family was moving in, a couple with 2 kids and a dog. They waved cheerfully, and I walked over to welcome them. The father grinned and said, "We heard the last neighbor here was a bit intense." I chuckled. "You could say that," I replied. "Don't worry. Things are quieter now." As they unpacked, their kids ran across the lawn, chasing the dog, laughter echoing through the street. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder for disapproving eyes. It was peaceful. Later that evening, I sat on my porch again, watching the sunset bleed gold across the rooftop. The memory of those flashing red and blue lights from that first day seemed like something from another life. Back then, I'd been angry, humiliated, determined to fight back. Now I was content. I had won, not by shouting or scheming, but by letting time and truth do their work. Karen's story had become a legend in the neighborhood, a cautionary tale told with equal parts laughter and disbelief. And every time someone mentioned her name, I couldn't help but smile. Because no matter how it started, it ended exactly as it should have, with justice served, peace peace restored, and the trespasser finally back on his own land, drinking coffee on the same porch where it all began. Months passed after the chaos finally settled, and the neighborhood that had once felt like a battlefield turned into a peaceful little pocket of normal life. The lawns looked greener, the air quieter, and the sound of laughter had replaced the constant clicking of Karen's heels on the pavement. Yet even though she was gone, her story lingered like a ghost people couldn't stop whispering about. New neighbors heard bits and pieces of it, always in disbelief that someone could be that obsessed with control. For me, it had become something of a strange legend, a memory both frustrating and hilarious. Every time I looked at the patch of driveway that technically used to be hers, I couldn't help but think of how far the story had come, from a ridiculous 911 call to a signed eviction notice bearing my own name. It was the kind of poetic symmetry that real life rarely gives, and I sometimes wondered if the universe had scripted it just to prove a point. Being the new HOA vice president kept me busier than I expected, but it also gave me perspective. I started attending regional HOA conferences, where board members from nearby communities gathered to discuss policies, conflicts, and case studies. At one event, someone brought up the topic of difficult homeowners. The stories people shared were wild. Someone built a pirate ship in their backyard, another neighbor kept 20 cats, and one guy repainted his house neon pink to protest HOA rules. When it was my turn, I told them about Karen. I didn't use her name, but as I described the events, the false trespassing call, the fake letters, the property battle, the room was silent. Then, as I reached the part about her signing the eviction notice, the entire group erupted into laughter and applause. It was cathartic to tell the story, not from anger but from amusement. Even other HOA leaders, people notorious for taking themselves too seriously, found it poetic. One woman leaned over and whispered, "You should write that down. That's not a story, that's a masterpiece." I didn't think much of it until a few weeks later, when a local podcast about neighborhood drama reached out asking if I'd share my experience anonymously. I hesitated at first, unsure if I wanted to reopen that chapter, but eventually, curiosity won. The episode went live under the title, "The HOA Karen Who Evicted Herself," and within days, it became one of their most streamed episodes. Listeners couldn't believe it was true. They flooded the comments with things like, "This needs to be a movie," and "That's karma with a signature." It was surreal seeing my once frustrating experience become something that entertained thousands. For the first time, I didn't feel like the victim of a nosy neighbor. I felt like the accidental protagonist of a moral lesson about patience, pride, and poetic justice. Life continued normally for a while. I rented out Karen's old house to a young couple who were the complete opposite of her. Friendly, respectful, and always quick to share a plate of food whenever they cooked too much. They even planted roses along the driveway where Karen's car used to sit, saying it felt right to replace stress with something beautiful. I couldn't argue with that. Sometimes, as I walked past the property, I thought about how it had once been a symbol of conflict but now stood as a quiet monument to how chaos can turn into calm. I never mentioned to the new tenants who used to live there. Some stories are better left as whispers, passed down like folklore rather than told directly. One rainy evening, months after everything had settled, I got a knock at my door. When I opened it, I froze for a second. It was Karen. She looked completely different. Her hair was shorter, her clothes plain, her face lined with the kind of weariness you only get when life finally humbles you. She wasn't holding a clipboard, no documents, no anger, just an umbrella and a faint smile. "I won't stay long," she said quietly. "I just came to apologize." I didn't know what to say. For a moment, I wondered if it was another one of her tricks, but her tone was different this time. She told me she had moved to a small rental outside town and was working part-time at a local office. "I lost more than a house," she admitted, looking at the rain pooling at her feet. "I lost myself in trying to control everyone else." There was a long silence between us, the kind that carries both regret and release. Finally, I said, "You don't owe me an apology, Karen. Life already gave you the lesson." She nodded, eyes glistening, and whispered, "I know. But it feels better saying it anyway." Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the drizzle without another word. I never saw her again after that. Her unexpected apology stuck with me. For years, I had imagined how I would react if she ever came back, maybe smug satisfaction or witty revenge. But when it actually happened, all I felt was peace. I realized that true victory isn't about seeing someone fall, it's about moving on while they're still trying to figure out why they tripped. I wasn't angry anymore. I just hoped she found some kind of balance, even if it was too late for her to fix what she'd broken. The following spring, the neighborhood held a community barbecue, the first one in years without tension or conflict. Families brought food, kids played in the street, and laughter echoed off every porch. As the evening sun dipped low, Ed clinked a glass and gave a short speech about how far the community had come. "A neighborhood isn't just houses and fences," he said. "It's the people who decide whether to build walls or bridges." Everyone clapped, and I couldn't help but glance toward the edge of the crowd where the roses bloomed along Karen's old driveway. The petals swayed gently in the breeze, glowing red against the fading light. It felt symbolic, the end of something harsh and the beginning of something softer. Later that night, as I sat alone on my porch sipping coffee, I thought about everything that had happened. The flashing lights, the screaming, the paperwork wars, the laughter that followed, all of it had somehow shaped not just me but the whole neighborhood. We were better for it, stronger, kinder, maybe even a little wiser. Sometimes people need a villain to realize how good peace feels when it finally returns. The irony was that the woman who once divided us had unknowingly brought everyone closer together. I looked out across my yard, the same one where it all began, and smiled at the thought that something so ridiculous had led to something so meaningful. Life, in its twisted sense of humor, had turned my worst neighbor into my greatest teacher. The lesson was simple. You can't control everything, but you can choose how you respond. And sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, patient, and perfectly timed. Like a signature on a document that changes everything. As the moon rose above the rooftops, I felt an overwhelming calm. The porch light flickered softly, the air smelled of rain and cut grass, and for the first time in years, there wasn't a single ounce of tension in the air. The story that began with a 911 call had ended not with shouting or punishment, but with silence and closure. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the crickets sing, and whispered to myself, "Trespassing, huh? Guess she was the one standing on the wrong side all along." Then I laughed quietly, took another sip of coffee, and let the night settle around me. The battle was over. The peace was real. And somewhere, I hoped, Karen was finally learning to live without needing to own every inch of it.